who took today. Today is a work day for my wife, guys. You may not see her every Sunday, but she said as soon as she found out I was preaching, I'm taking off. Don't matter the day, I'm taking off. And so thank you so much for coming to support and to be there for me. She's been just thrilled. She's excited about it all week. I mean, just really excited. She's like, how do you feel? I'm like, I don't know. So she's thrilled. Even this morning, she's like, you want me to talk on the ride? You want me to be quiet? What do you want? She's just, so thank you so much. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump in. So as I was preparing for today's message, I was thinking about when I was a kid in elementary school, and one of the things that I loved to do and all the kids in my school loved to do was race. Like, we loved to race. Now, there was a particular type of race that was different, though, and one reason why we liked to race was because, and maybe your school was like mine, maybe it wasn't, but like how fast you were directly correlated to how cool you were, right? So if you were the first fastest kid in the class, you were the first coolest kid in the class, right? Second fastest, and likewise. And so we used to race during recess, and we used to race on days like field day. And on field day, we had a special kind of race that you're familiar with probably, is a relay race. And what's different about it is a team aspect to the relay race. And you have a baton that you have to pass on to the next person, and the whole team can get a victory. You don't have to necessarily be the fastest person to get the victory. Your team just has to be fastest. And so this one particular year, I remember it, there were the two fastest kids in the class were on the same team. And everybody was like, man, you're going to put Gary and Brad on the same team? Man, we were already defeated. And so it's pretty much the opposite of the song, right? And so we were, like, man. And so the kids were the fastest two were on the same team, like, oh, we got this. And so the teacher says, on your mark, get set, go. And nothing spectacular happened. I mean, it went exactly how you would expect. The fastest kids start winning. But then something did happen. The kid fumbles the handoff to the fastest kid, drops the baton. So everybody else is doing their thing. He drops his baton, though. And now it's a high-pressure situation. They're embarrassed. They don't know what to do. So they're fumbling, trying to figure out what to do, how to get it. And they drop the baton again. So now everybody's dusting them. I mean, blowing them out. I mean, the slowest kids in the class are ahead of them. It doesn't matter. And the fastest kid, he's pushing, he's pumping, he's running as hard as he can. And it's to no avail. They come in last place. And so something really interesting to me about that was because I learned the worst thing about a relay race is if one person drops the baton, it slows everyone behind them down, right? Everyone's affected. And if your goal is to win, the handoff is just as important as how well you run. Today, our subject is pass it on. Pass it on. So maybe you're here and you love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, but your kids don't. Your nieces and nephews, they don't. Maybe you've been blessed with a position of leadership on your job, in a social club, and those people, you have influence with them, but they don't know God. They don't walk with God. What if God has placed you in leadership? Or maybe you're mentoring or coaching others, and people look to you, but they don't know God. If that's you, today, this message is for you. We're going to discuss successfully passing on our faith to those coming behind us. And we're going to talk about what happens when we don't successfully pass the baton, and 3 things we can do to ensure a successful passing of the baton. Our text today comes from Judges 2:10-12 in the ESV, and it reads, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger. And also, you can follow along, I believe, on the YouVersion Bible app and under events. So if you've got that, you can do it. Or if you got the old school way, you can do it as well by flipping your pages. So let's provide some context. Let's talk about where we're at. So at this point in Scripture, Moses has already come. God calls Moses and pulls him out of Egypt, says, hey, I've anointed you to go ahead and deliver the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage. He goes and brings them out by God's hand, and it's miracles and signs and wonders, and it's just amazing. God struck Egypt, which was the major world power of the day. And those people, that generation comes out, and then they're rebellious. They got attitude, right? They got attitude with God. They start complaining about every little thing. You ever been in that situation too? Sometimes you go to people that are in need and you try to give them something, you got attitude, which that's a whole nother thing. But, you know, they had attitude. They were talking about God, talking about Moses, and they rebelled. And God said, you know what? I got time. So for every day y'all acted up for 40 days, you're going to take a lap for a year for each day. 40 years until that generation dies off. The generation dies off, and then God ordains Moses again to review the covenant with the next generation that's come up, their children. And we call that retelling of the covenant Deuteronomy. It's the second telling. He tells that. So that's the whole book on just telling them what I told your parents. And so God, in Deuteronomy, he commands the children of Israel to tell their children from generation to generation what he's done for the Israelites. Deuteronomy 4:9, it reads this way: only be on your guard and diligently watch yourselves so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, and so they do not slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and grandchildren. So God has commanded them to pass it along, and he raises up Joshua and Caleb. They're leaders. They have the faith to possess the land. So he gives them victory everywhere they go. And they weren't perfect. They weren't perfect. And the children of that generation of Israel was not perfect. They didn't perfectly follow what God had declared, but he gave them enough to work with, right? And that's my son being the distraction. And so, God gave them victory. They gave him enough to work with. They were faithful enough that God said, I can use you. And so he gives them victory on every side. And here we are in Scripture. That generation dies. Another generation comes up on the scene and does not know God or what he's done for Israel. So despite the Lord's commands to talk about it and pass it down, and pass down the reverence of the Lord and to share the different customs. He gave them the Ark of the Covenant. He gave them 12 stones at the Jordan River. He gave them the Sabbath day rest, and they were to review the Torah on the Sabbath every week. He gave them the keeping of feasts, and holidays like the Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles and unleavened bread. And that reminds me a little bit of today, right? There's churches on every corner. You can pick your church. It's like, man, where we feel like today? What do I got an appetite for today? You can choose your church. You can listen to as much Christian TV. You can listen to your church on Spotify. Your favorite pastors on Spotify and podcasts. And you've got a buffet of things. We've got Easter and Christmas holidays. You got people preaching on Instagram and TikTok. And yet there are generations today that don't know God. That don't know God. So what does that mean for us today? Well, first, it's our responsibility to successfully pass down our faith to those who come behind us. It's our responsibility. Secondly, it only takes one generation to drop the baton so that future generations do not know God. And we've dropped the baton. We aren't praying together. We stopped bringing our children to church. We stopped explaining why church is even important. And we instead prioritize school and sports over their spiritual development. Yeah, I'm a toe stepper. I'm a toe stepper. And now there's a generation of people, again, that do not know God. So let's look at Judges 2:13 through 16. It shows us what happens to the next generation that doesn't know the Lord. 13 reads, because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths, in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Now, that's concerning, right? I'm not used to hearing that the Lord was working against somebody. I mean, we just sung that he's never defeated. You know, he's going to have my back. We love to sing about how the Lord is never defeated. He's going to be your shield. He's going to protect you. He's got your back. Well, the song is right. The Lord is never defeated, but you certainly can be. You certainly can be. He's undefeated. And let's look at the actual scriptures, what they say. It says, they forsook the Lord and they served other gods. That's interesting. They served the Baals. They served the other gods. And today that looks like us serving, we may be following the universe and what the universe is telling us. Or we might be listening to our horoscope. And that stuff is not of God. We're talking to psychics and all these different things. That's not of God. The Lord gave them into the hands of raiders, and he sold them into the hand of their enemies. Whenever they went to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them. Think about that. So it's not only saying that, like, God didn't have their back. He didn't help them. He was actually working actively against them. He was their enemy. And that's really interesting. It's the kids of the people he brought into that land. It's because they violated their covenant with him. And to quote Floyd Mayweather Jr., if you violate, we demonstrate. I mean, and he demonstrated. He was actively working against them. So what does that mean for us today? The next generation is not walking in the victory they could have if they knew the Lord. Think of the things young people are struggling with today. They're experiencing gender dysphoria. There's an epidemic of anxiety and depression. Suicide is at all-time highs. Mass shootings every other week. It makes you almost miss gang violence. At least it was predictable. It's like young people are opting not to get married. Those that do are at greater risk of divorce. Pornography addiction is on the rise, and intimacy amongst couples is in the dumps. Is it because we haven't passed our faith on and our hope on? Passed our faith in God? I can assure you they would walk in greater peace and victory if they had the Lord. So now we've talked about the consequences of botching and fumbling the handoff. Let's look at what the Israelites should have done to raise up the next generation to serve the Lord and discuss 3 things we can do to successfully pass the baton. So what should the Israelites have done to pass on their faith? Well, number 1, God expected them to share their story of what he did for them, right? That's why he had all these festivals and reminders and memorials. He wanted them to remember. They were to talk about it with their kids and grandkids. He wanted them to remember how he executed judgments on Pharaoh and Egypt and their gods, how he parted the Red Sea so they could walk on dry ground, but drowned Pharaoh and his army. He killed the firstborn in all of Egypt down to the animals and passed over the children of Israel and saved their livestock. How he fed them every day for 40 years with manna, bread from heaven, and quail in the desert. How he parted the Jordan River so they could walk on into the promised land, and how that when they marched around Jericho's walls, one day, every day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day, the walls came down. He wanted them to talk about that. He wanted them to pass on their history with their children, with their history with God, with their children. So my question for you is, does the next generation know what God has done for you? The first key is you've got to share your story. Have you shared with him how he restored your broken family, and how he kept your house from being foreclosed, and how he paid your rent when you didn't have the money, how he got you the job you were underqualified for, how he gave you peace when you had none, how he healed your heart when you were hurt beyond words, how he kept you from going to prison, how he healed your body when the doctors said there was nothing else that they could do, how he saved you and pulled you out of your filthy sin and gave you a new nature and called you his own. Do they know that? Do they know? Growing up as a child, I was blessed to hear the stories of my parents and my family. And my parents passed on the legacy of faith, and they would tell me different things that were going on and things that happened in our family. And I happened to learn about my own grandfather and how he was a devil at a time. He was a devil. He was violent and angry and an alcoholic, and he inspired fear everywhere he went. And how God was able to touch his heart, change his mind, restore his family, and that we were all able to reconcile and come and serve the Lord all together, united as a family under God. And I'll tell you something that's interesting about that. A few months back, I was talking with a gentleman, and he was sharing with me about how his family was broken and how he loved God with all his heart, and how he wanted more for his family, and how his parents couldn't stand each other. They were divorced. It was a bitter divorce, and how his brothers and everybody was disjointed. And he told me that, and I told him the story from my family. And he said, you know what? Thank you for sharing that with me, because now I've got the faith that God can restore my family. And God used him in his family. And now his parents were able to make amends and be on good terms. His father's serving the Lord. His brothers are serving the Lord. They're reunited as a family. And it's because my parents passed on their faith and their stories to me, I passed on their story to my friend. And God used him. So we've got to share our story. Share your story. Share your story. Okay. So now, what else can we do to pass it on? Well, we must, number 2, we must continue Christ's story in our lives. Galatians 2:20 reads, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Another reason, and one of the main reasons, the next generation complains about not wanting to necessarily take on our faith is they haven't necessarily seen Christ in us. They haven't seen Christ in us. Right? So many talk about how they see their parents praising God, and they singing all their songs, and dancing, and then on the way home from church getting cussed out. They didn't even make it through the door. You know how they see their parents maybe not conducting themselves with integrity and uprightness of heart. They're lying and cheating. Let's let our light shine wherever we are. We've got to ask ourselves, is it me living or is Christ living in me? We've all seen the wristbands, what would Jesus do? So much so that it has no power anymore. It's cliche. But we've got to allow Jesus to continue his story in our lives. We've got to let him continue his love, his kindness, his compassion to those in need, his care for the poor, his self-sacrifice, his submission to God, his passion for righteousness, his courage to stand against wrongdoing, and to speak out against it, his willingness to forgive, and his peace that passes all understanding. We've got to show that. We've got to demonstrate that. We've got to allow him to live that out in our lives. He didn't die just to die. He died so that we could live as he would live. So we must share our story, continue Christ's story, and teach them how to properly love God. How to properly love God. A few years back, a lot of you may remember, a revolutionary book came out. It's called The 5 Love Languages. And everybody was interested in the 5 love languages. It's like you're trying to guess, oh, I'm gifts. Oh, that person is acts of service. Or they're, what's the other? Physical touch. You know, and you're trying to figure out, quality time, words of affirmation. And the interesting thing about love languages is you can be sending love in your favorite mode of love, but you may not be, the other person may not ever receive it because you're not speaking it in their favorite mode of communication. And so the book teaches you how important it is to love people the way they like to be loved. It's really important. You got to love people the way they like to be loved. And the same is true with God. We must love him the way he likes to be loved and served. Now, there's some young people or inexperienced people that are coming up, and they mean well. But they're not serving God and loving God the way he likes to be loved. So, let's think about how they may try to love God, but they don't know. They may think it's okay to mix Eastern religion with their faith and the worship of God. They're burning sage and carrying crystals and doing witchcraft and practicing with astrology. They don't know that's not for our God. They think it's okay to cut and paste American political affiliations into their faith. And newsflash, God is neither Democrat nor is he Republican. And I'll tell you a secret, he's not even American. But before Abraham was, I am. I am before Abraham. So he's beyond that. And my personal favorite that I see is that people think God doesn't require obedience to his word, but he likes a good heart. But there are no good hearts without him. There are no good hearts without him. There are no good hearts. And God has love languages too. His love languages are praise, worship, faith, obedience, and exclusive devotion to him as our God. So we've got to teach the next generation how to love God. Are you teaching them that there must be no other gods before him? Are you teaching them to lean not to their own understanding, but in all their ways acknowledge him? That we demonstrate our faith through our works. That he prefers obedience to sacrifice. That what they do to the least of these, they do unto him. To how to love their neighbor. Forsake not the assembly of the believer. To be holy because the Lord your God is holy. Sometimes they mean well, but just like Apollos in Acts chapter 18, verse 26, he was preaching, and Aquila and Priscilla pulled him aside. They said, "Come here, brother." And they taught him the way of God more accurately. Sometimes there's people that are coming up that we need to pull aside. They have a heart for God, but they don't know how to serve him properly. Pull them aside and say, "Let me teach you the way of God more accurately. I like the fervor. I like your attitude. You have the right heart, but let me teach you the way of God more accurately." And we've got to do that. We've got to do that. Our God is a generational God. That's why he introduces himself. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's something that's supposed to be passed down. That relationship is to be passed from generation to generation. And we can all be so focused on running our own race, but the truth is, we're all in a relay race. It's not enough to finish your leg of the race. The way we run, the way we carry the baton of our faith, and the way we pass it to generations to come affects them ongoing. It's our responsibility to ensure a smooth passing of the baton. And if we drop it during the handoff, it causes a chain reaction, and we don't know which generation will finally pick it up. As we can see in the children of Israel and the generations of today alike, if we don't pass on our faith to the next generation, they will simply adopt the gods and practices of the people around them. Pass on the faith God has given you to your children and your grandchildren, your mentees, and any and every up-and-coming person you have influence with. Pass it on. I'm here today because my parents passed on their legacy of faith, and you witnessed the beginning of me passing on my legacy of faith to my son. It's the first step of many. He's not even conscious, but he's coming into faith. I'm going to hand it on to him. And I'm going to pass that faith to any other person that God sends in my path, that he gives me the strength and the influence with. This is Youth Emphasis Month. Sign your kid up if you got a teenager for the Ignite Youth Conference, if you haven't already. We've got the co-leaders right here, and they've got some other leaders at Word of Faith. They will take and pass on that faith. Pass it on. And if you don't have a teenager, sponsor one. You can still pass it on. Sponsor one. But pass it on by sharing your story, continuing Christ's story, and teaching the next generation how to properly love God.